Nelson, a resident of Culpeper, Virginia, is an historical investigator, writer, and advocate for an organization named Writing the Record. Zann's academic and instructional background includes a bachelor's degree with a concentration in peace and conflict studies from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, which she received summa cum laude. She also has a graduate certificate in nonprofit management from Georgetown University and a Virginia Supreme Court certification as a trained mediator. The research she shares today certainly comes with an amazing background. For more than 40 years, Zann has researched and advocated for the untold stories and the silent voices of the many people who have gone before us. She founded a company called Writing the Record to help educate people with the research she discovered. This organization tries to correct, add, and or amend the histories that have been ignored, denied, or excluded through history, especially in the African American community here in Virginia. Some examples of the practical application of her research would be: she provided the foundational material for the circuit court judge in Culpeper to rule that the 3 victims of lynching in Culpeper were innocent of the charges filed against them. Zann spent over 20 years researching the cases of these men, not an easy task, as the lynchings took place in 1849, 1877, and 1918. She spearheaded the passage of SJR, I think that's social justice.
No,
No?
the Senate.
Oh, okay, see, it's got a fancy term. The passage of SJR 297 in the 2019 Virginia General Assembly. It was a landmark resolution apologizing for lynching in Virginia. She also researched the domestic slave trade, and in particular, the Louisiana 16 Project and its impact on enslaved families sold by President James Madison in 1834, and the discovery of their living descendants. Zann is presently working toward a permanent and public memorial to the men of color born in Culpeper who fought for the United States of America during the Civil War. And in her spare time, I believe, Zann helped design the Culpeper Museum. Yes, and that's in her spare time. With everything Zann is doing, we're honored to have her with us this morning and share her research on the United States veterans from Orange County still unrecognized. Please welcome Zann.
That museum gig was full time. Okay. Good morning.
Good morning.
I gotta get back on here. I thought I was so prepared. There we go. Okay. So we are going to talk primarily about the men of color who fought during the Civil War. And we're going to do 4 parts. The first part, we'll do a sort of an overview of the United States colored troops. The second part will address the question that many people have, did the people, men of color, whether they were enslaved or free, did they fight for the Confederacy? The third part is a call to action, and the fourth part is, hopefully you'll have some questions for me, whether they're related to this topic or related to something else. So, we'll get started. How many of you all know what the acronym USCT stands for? Charles.
United
Okay.
States
What does
Colored
it stand
Troops.
for?
United States Colored Troops.
Yes, okay. And it was established by a general order on May 22nd, 1863 as part of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Prior to this, there were very few black units, and they were not under federal jurisdiction. There were many of these.
Sorry, wrong room, wrong meeting. Keep going.
You can stay. So there were many African Americans who attempted to enlist in the United States Army or Navy, but there was no mechanism for them because it was completely segregated. They could serve as laborers, but not as soldiers. Not until the spring of 1863, and following the establishment of the Bureau of Colored Regiments, and according to the African American Civil War Museum in Georgetown, African American Civil War Soldiers Museum, 209,145 troops were enlisted once they were allowed to, which was 1/10 of the United States forces. That's really important because it came in 63, which of course was midway in the war, and you'll hear later the Confederates had laws that disallowed bringing people of color in as soldiers. So, plus the North had more men and potential soldiers to begin with than the South did. So when you add another 1/10 of what you've got, I think it's fair to say that probably tipped the scales. Had they not been allowed to join, I'm not sure what would have happened. But what I want you to go away with, one thing I want you to go away with today, is not thinking that these men were in some unit that was, not really the Army. They were in the United States Colored Troops. So that doesn't really count. My phone is ringing in my ear. I'm sorry. Because that wasn't true. When they enlisted, and I've got with me some copies of some primary resources. This is a copy of an enlistment paper. They didn't join the United States Colored Troops. They joined the United States Army or Navy. And they took an oath of allegiance to defend and protect the United States of America against all enemies and opposers. That's the way it read. They were and are bona fide United States veterans. And in most communities, Orange, Culpeper, Madison, there are no exceptions, they are not recognized publicly anywhere. Okay, now I know you want to hear specifically about Orange. How many of you all are actually from Orange?
Wait, Orange, Connecticut.
Oh, there. Okay, all right. Well, we're glad to have you because you chose to be here, right? You aren't here because your grandparents were here. But over the years, and I started this research, I don't know, 15 years ago. But to date, we have documented 78 men of color born in Orange County, Virginia, who fought for the United States of America during the Civil War. 78 United States veterans who are not acknowledged anywhere. But it's interesting about the 78, and it's meticulous work because if you think about your timeline in the prior to 1863, I may not have that date exactly right, all of West Virginia was Virginia. So when you're looking at these records and it says Somerset, Virginia, you put them down. But they're not from Somerset, Virginia. They're from Somerset, West Virginia. So you have to go back and sort of go through and double check that if you want accuracy. So we did all that. We've got to 78, and we have a great deal of information about each one of them that we pulled from a database called Fold 3. It is subscription based, but it's just fabulous. And I'm working on a book. I've got it probably about 70% finished, and Charles has helped me quite a bit, if nothing else, with enthusiasm and morale. When is that book going to be published? But one of the things that I think is so interesting, I mean, the data tells us, about how tall they are, what color their eyes are, what color their hair is, what color their complexion is, where they were born. Sometimes you get special notes in there that they had a wife who was living over here. But the most important thing, I think, is it tells you not where they were living necessarily when they enlisted, but where they enlisted. So I narrowed that down to 3 categories. Enlistment in, Helen. Thank you. Charles did these maps for me, and we gave them to each county and much bigger on a poster. But anyway, that'll help you understand what I'm about to tell you. So we have free states. And of that 78, 22 of those men enlisted in a free state. Then I have local areas, which pretty much means DC or Northern Virginia. And there were 11 of those 78 who enlisted there. And here's the horrific one. The southern slaveholding states. Now, of course, Virginia was the slaveholding states, but I'm talking about the ones in the deeper south. 39 of those 78 enlisted in those states. The color coding, I think, is pretty clear. The dark blue is free. I can't remember the other colors. Thank you. The yellow is the local, and the orangish color are the deeper southern slaveholding states. So, let me explain those a little bit to you. Oh, and if you did the math in your head, which I can't do, there are 6 others that we're just not sure where they fall. So, when we talk about enlisting in free states, these men were either born free and relocated. They were born in Orange, but they may have been born as free people and relocated to a free state. They could have been manumitted, or which is the single person term for emancipated. If you were manumitted in Virginia after 1806, you had a year to get out of town. There were special exceptions, but they were rare, that allowed you to stay. The other possibility is that they successfully escaped and basically self-manumitted. They did not have to fight for their own freedom. They had it. And yet, they opted to go back into this area, into a situation where they could be killed, captured, or re-enslaved. And I think that says a lot about their character. I don't think they did that just for the paycheck. Well, I mean, you know, it may have been difficult to earn a living, but they were in a free state. So what about the locals? Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to give you an example, and these are great examples, of those who were born in Culpeper but enlisted in a free state, and that's the Crump brothers. There was Thomas and Fleming. Fleming was born in 1836 here in Orange County. He enlisted October the 31st, 1864 in Troy County, Ohio. He was in the 27th United States Colored Infantry Company K, and his rank was a private. Private Crump was a 28-year-old farmer when he enlisted in the military. He was described as 5'7", with yellow complexion, black hair, and black eyes. He served a year and 16 days before being discharged on September 7th, 1865 at New Bern, North Carolina. Now his brother Thomas, who was 3 years younger, born in 1839, enlisted on August the 9th, 1864, Troy County, Ohio, 27th United States Colored Infantry, in a different company though. He was in Company I. He was described as a farmer, so I'm thinking those boys lived together in Troy, Ohio, and they were working together on this farm. Brown complexion, black hair, black eyes, 5'5". He was 27 years old. Somebody didn't get those numbers right. He was also discharged in New Bern, North Carolina. But here's when you're doing this kind of research, I mean, I'd hate for you to see the room I keep all the research in. But I know when a name comes up that, oh, that's really familiar. Several years ago, I did a research project on a white woman by the name of Lucy Quarles. Lucy Quarles lived in Bloomsbury, and she was a widow when she passed away in 1841, and she freed about 70 of her slaves, including the Crump brothers. And she provided for them, all of those that she freed, to go to Ohio. So it just all comes around. I'm doing this research. See, I see these fellows, they've enlisted in Ohio, and I'm thinking, boy, that Crump name sounds really familiar. I went back and checked the Quarles records, and there they were. So they were born at Bloomsbury, these two young men. Now we can talk about the locals. More than likely they would have attached themselves to Union troops until they could get to somewhere that was accepting black soldiers, or a refugee camp like the Freedmen's Village in Alexandria. Prior to that, they were living at home here in the county, close to the time of enlistment. One of the things, and I don't have the exact numbers with me, but there's a record in the Library of Virginia that you can access online of Southern claims for slaves that escaped to the enemy. So, and you can search it by county, and it gives the slave owner's name. It also gives those that escaped, it gives their first name, their gender, and their age. And in 1862, this is when these records were kept. In 1862, the Union Army was in Culpeper under a commander by the name of Pope, and that was when they had the Battle of Cedar Mountain, and both sides claimed victory. But the Union forces went back to Culpeper Courthouse and stayed there for a while. During that time, about 300 or 400 people of color from Orange County crossed the Rapidan River trying to align themselves with these Union soldiers. Now, there was no USCT at the time. And those Union soldiers didn't have a refugee camp in Culpeper. But they could take them in to help with the laundry or blacksmithing, or as they moved north where they could get closer to a refugee camp. And refugee camps became enlistment centers all over the country where the war was being fought. So we do have an example of, I don't know whether he was one listed during that particular 1862, but his name was William Brooks. He was born in 1842, and he enlisted in November of 1864 in the city of Washington, which is the way it's often written. And just a little quirky little thing. At that time, the city of Washington included what we know of as the city of Alexandria. And then later on, the District of Columbia gave that back to Virginia. 22-year-old William Brooks was described as 5'3½", brown complexion with gray eyes and brown hair. His occupation was listed as a servant. Private Brooks was discharged on November 30th, 1865 in Texas. There was a fort in Texas that was out in the Gulf of Mexico, and the area was called Brazos Santiago. The reason that's somewhat, I'm trying to get my screen back down here, somewhat important is because a lot of the soldiers who were discharged there, Fort Brown was there, and they stayed and enlisted in the regular army and became those two famous regiments of buffalo soldiers. Now, I'm sorry, I'm not the savviest technology person in the room, I'm sure, but I can't get this thing off the screen. Now I did it. Okay. Trial and error. Okay, so now comes to your printouts. Slaveholding states. These men gave their place of birth when they enlisted as Orange County, Virginia. But their enlistment location might be Natchez, Mississippi, or Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, Alabama, or Kentucky. This is documentation for what we call the domestic slave trade, which is another story altogether, from Orange to the Deep South. But there were more people of color relocated during the 50 years of the domestic slave trade out of Virginia than the entire years of transporting them out of Africa to partially to the United States. And one of the big things that comes up out of these studies, whether it's my studies on lynching or the studies of the domestic slave trade or the Civil War soldiers, the most tragic outcome is the fragmentation of a family. And we did it over and over and over again. So, but the fact that you find these men enlisting in places like Natchez, Mississippi, I'm sorry, it keeps jumping back up here. You do have to wonder why. Why did they enlist? And how is it first let me get you to how that was possible. But before I do that, let me ask you, does anybody have an idea about how a man enslaved in Natchez, Mississippi, or Tennessee or Arkansas could join the United States Army? Yes,
I'm gonna take a guess.
okay.
I'm gonna say, what about a slaveholder offering up his slaves so he doesn't have to go?
Would that be okay, except that slaveholder would be going to the Confederate Army, not the Union Army?
Oh, so you're saying that Natchez, Louisiana, or wherever that is, they were joining the Union Army
Yes, absolutely,
during the Civil War?
yes.
I didn't think there were any Union armies down there.
Well,
And
you
that's
would
why-
be wrong.
I guess. Because it's all orange.
So, yeah, it is, but just an oversimplification, and you can pick on Charles afterwards, because he could give you all the details. But Grant's big expeditions were in that part of the world. And he captured, the point was, they wanted to capture some of these ports in Louisiana, which was one of the, New Orleans was one of the first places they captured. But on the Mississippi River, they needed to capture those so they could slow down any supplies that the Confederacy was trying to move about. So when the Union Army came in and took over, a couple of things happened. Number one, we're after 1863, and so they're carrying the Emancipation Proclamation with them, and they can enforce it because they got the men and the power and the authority and so forth and so on. But the other thing is they set up refugee camps. And so a lot of these newly freed people flocked to the refugee camps. And as I said earlier, those refugee camps often became enlistment centers. And some of it wasn't pretty. I've heard this from some other historians who study this. The Union Army was tasked with meeting quotas. And the draft wasn't going so well for them. They had the big draft riot in New York City, and it was awful. But they were down there, they needed to make their quotas, and sometimes they would threaten a man and tell him, if you don't enlist, we're no longer going to have room for your family in this refugee center. So there was some of that going on as well. But there were other reasons possibly why these men would enlist. Can anybody imagine why they would do that? They have the opportunity now. They're technically free, they're living in a refugee camp, let's say they haven't been threatened. Why would they join up? Anybody got a guess? You want to guess?
They were promised something at the end?
They were what?
Promised something, land, money, or something at the end?
Well, I don't know about the end, but they certainly would get a bonus. They were offering $100 bonuses for enlisting, and you'd get a paycheck. So I think that was probably a big reason. Anybody else have a thought? Yes?
If the North didn't win, they wouldn't remain free.
I'm sorry?
If the North didn't win, they wouldn't remain free.
No.
So they had an incentive to fight for the North.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly correct. Okay. Or there's one other one, and this one you might not guess all by yourself, but remember these people used to live in Virginia, and perhaps they had family, mothers and fathers, sisters, wives, children, so they may have thought it was a way to get back home. I mean, we don't have any way of proving it, we can't ask them. And they didn't put, there wasn't a question on their enlistment papers, why are you joining? So, I want to tell you about one particular fella. His name is Caleb Lenza. Now, I think, and it's just my opinion, but I know a little bit about people who used to live in Orange. And there were Lindsays that lived in Orange. There are Lindsays that live in Orange now. I'm thinking that was the original name, Caleb Lindsay. And I love putting myself in these positions where you're somebody out of Massachusetts and you're enlisting this guy who's never been off the farm, doesn't know how to read and write, and all his experiences with other people like himself, and maybe you're having trouble understanding him. And he's having trouble understanding you. I factor that into the 1870 census, which is just amazing. Caleb Lenza was born in Orange County in 1793. Yet he enlisted April 5th, 1865 at Camp Nelson, Kentucky, in the 124th United States Colored Infantry. There were remarks noted on his papers at enlistment stating that he was a slave in Kentucky owned by a George Brown. I've tried to do a little of that research, but it's too common of a name, George Brown. Caleb became sick almost immediately and was hospitalized at Camp Nelson from April 1865 until July 1865. He was listed as a deserter, being absent without leave. I want you to think about that. These people are out in the field, okay? No. Don't have walkie-talkies. Don't have telegraphs, except in certain areas. They rely on eventually getting a report from over there, brought to them by a courier on horseback, maybe. So the idea of being absent without leave, number one, you don't have the background material. And number two, that applied to anybody who didn't show up that morning for roll call. Okay, so they said he was a deserter. Apparently, they later found out he was sick in the hospital and wrote in his papers that, quote, absent without leave was written in error, end quote. And I was so thankful that they at least got that far. There is no record of his discharge or the outcome of his hospitalization. If you've done the math, you will know that Caleb Lindsay of Orange County, Virginia was 72 years old when he enlisted. I can only imagine what was driving him. Okay, so I'm going to pause there for a second and ask you if you have any questions, because we're going to move into sort of a different category. Do you have any questions at this time? And you can ask them later about what I've shared. Maybe it caused you to wonder about something. No questions?
I have a question.
Okay.
Okay, I know I'm confused. So this guy was owned by someone,
Caleb Lenza,
was owned by somebody Brown.
when he was in Kentucky. We don't know when he went to Kentucky.
He was born in Virginia.
He was born in Orange County, owned by somebody here.
Named Brown.
No.
No.
Okay, that's where I'm getting at. So he's in Kentucky, he's owned by somebody, and he enlisted.
Right.
How did that happen? If somebody owned
It's
it?
a very good question, and I don't have the answer.
Okay. So I'm not-
Apparently,
I'm
he
not-
was given permission to enlist. And I will clarify that George Brown could have been in Orange and decided to move to Kentucky and take all his property with him. So Caleb got to Kentucky either with his Orange County owner, maybe he was sold again later, maybe he was sold right from the get-go here in Orange, and when he was bought and taken to Kentucky. I don't have those answers. There's a lot of good paperwork, but it's not 100%. So I don't know. I mean, there's several places we look, and we would never know about Caleb Lindsay if it wasn't for the record keeping of the United States Army. And they did a really great job, and it's all been digitized now. Any other?
Perhaps George Brown was either a Union supporter or the Union troops wouldn't ravage his farmstead if he gave.
Well, and Kentucky was not a rebel state.
No.
It was a border state.
Yeah.
But they were a slaveholding state. So some of the Kentuckians supported the Union troops. Did somebody else?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask about, with the people of color who were slaves, typically their last name was of their original slaveholder, correct or no? I was just wondering if that was the case because you were saying Lindsay, Lindsay.
Well, that whole surname thing confounds a lot of us because there is no real pattern. There are some who take their former owner's last name. There are some who absolutely do not. It was a very matriarchal society. Your status as a free person or an enslaved person depended on your mother. So if I'm enslaved by Joe Blow over here and I have a child by somebody on that plantation over there, well, my child belongs to my owner. And they don't even talk about that guy over there. He has no rights. He's not listed as the father. So you're taking the mother's last name, maybe. And I see that as a pattern. I see also what appears that when freedom arrives and they have to have a last name, that there may be some white family that was really good to them and they like them. The other pattern that I do see is that they will take their occupation and turn it into a name.
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
Smith for blacksmith. I'm drawing a blank here.
Carpenter.
Carpenter, yeah. And Freeman is a very popular last name. The one thing that really puzzles me, and I've never gotten to the bottom of it, is when the Freedmen's Bureau came in, now they came in about 1866, okay? They've got 4 years till they have to do the 1870 census. And now they've got millions of additional people that have to be registered for that census. People who can't read or write for the most part. People who don't understand what you're saying, and you don't understand what they're saying. And they're very suspicious of, because they've just been thrown into this. They were given classes on how to be free. Okay, so, but the Freedmen's Bureau is registering everybody, and particularly when they did the mass marriage rights, you had to have a last name. So if I said to you, okay, what's your last name? I don't have one. Well, you have to have one. Did they help them get the last name? I don't know. But it's a possibility because they had to have one. Interestingly, when these guys joined the Army several years earlier, they had a last name. ways, I don't think they would have used their owner's name.
Mhm.
I don't know, so much of it is just, thinking, okay, what would I do in this situation? What is common sense? What are they doing? So, but that surname business is really tough, really tough. Other questions?
I guess just a comment, I can see Caleb Lindsay going and being interviewed and with his accent saying, I'm Caleb Lindsay. Lindsay,
Yeah.
you know, and that's how it got written down.
Oh, no,
How do
absolutely.
you spell that? Well, I don't know.
Exactly, cause he on this paper right here, this is a copy of his enlistment paper, and he just makes his mark. There are a few we've come across that actually sign their own name. But this is the same thing that happens to immigrants who
I was
come
gonna say.
in to Ellis Island.
their
And
names
they got
changed.
some guy who talks like, I can't do the Brooklyn accent.
I can.
And he says, what's your name?
And they spell it the way they feel it.
Yeah,
That's what
absolutely.
they do.
So it's a communication issue, and those of us trying to find ancestors stumble over that. And then there are those who were given names, slave names, first and last, and they don't want them. So they get freedom and they change everything altogether. Nobody's gonna ever find them.
Mhm.
But anyway, let's go on to the question that so many people go, oh, that's not true. What about the stories that men of color fought for the Confederacy? Well, I don't mess around with it too much, it's a lie. The key word is fought. Not until March 13th, 1865, did the Confederacy change its law about accepting black men into their armies as soldiers. And they did that, a small number of men were recruited near Richmond. And the numbers, when you read the data, it goes from 40 men to 200 men. Oh, well, no, there were 100 men. Oh, no, there were 150 men. So a lot of it was just propaganda. They were coming in one person at a time. I mean, there was a pretty big enclave of African Americans in Richmond. But at that point, they surrendered in April, early April of that same year. So it was too little too late. But there were black men, both free and enslaved, who served the Confederate Army as body servants, nurses, teamsters, and ditch diggers, among other forms of labor. In 1924, Virginia allowed that they could receive a pension for their service if they were still alive and the application was approved. Now that's not just sort of anti-black, although 1924 from 1865 is a pretty long period. But it wasn't until 1888 that the Commonwealth of Virginia allowed men who had suffered a severe disability, like an amputation, or their widow, to get a pension. So it's the same old, same old. I know you all know, in every war, they hype up the idea, you need to go fight for your country, we love you, and you're gonna get all these benefits when you come home. And you come home and there's nothing, or it's insufficient, and it's going on now. So, it's like the car salesman. It couldn't be any sweeter when you're buying the car. But when you bring it back in because it's not working correct, right? Oh, well, no, we can't help you. So, anyway, all right. So the names of those who applied for pensions from Orange County. Now, they weren't all born in Orange County, but they were living in Orange County in 1924 when they were allowed to apply. Wilson Comfort was his name. He was born in Spotsylvania County as a free man. He was never enslaved. Here's a picture of Wilson Comfort. Nice looking guy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Jesse Henderson, born in Louisa County but moved to Orange, to a place called Thornhill. Is that still around? It's probably a postal area. I looked for it, I couldn't find it, but I've got to dig a little deeper. He has an interesting case. He was sent to serve an engineering company, or company of engineers. He built bridges, and he did some cooking. His pension was not allowed because they said there was no pension for servants building bridges. So he didn't get the $25. Solon Robinson was from Gordonsville. And he was owned by a man named H.E. Davis. He did get his pension. And then there's Henry Clay. And I'm telling you, in this business, there must be 4 dozen African Americans I've come across whose name is Henry Clay. In Culpeper, we have Henry Clay Lightfoot from Culpeper, born in 1842, and Henry Clay Lightfoot, born in Mitchells, both black men, and it's really hard to trace their genealogy. He was born about 10 years later. But anyway, this Henry Clay was born in Madison, and lived in Orange for 67 years. When he put down on his papers what he did and who got him into the forces, he said he was a servant to his young master, then as a nurse in the hospital. He was owned by George, I'm never sure whether it's Pannell or Pennell, but he was a very prosperous farmer in Raccoon Ford. And if you drive into Rapidan on the Culpeper side, there's a big sign that says the Pannell Park. So I'm going to stop there with you all later, if you want, you can come up and look at these things, and maybe you'll have an appreciation for, this is Jesse Henderson, for why I have bad eyesight. So, do you have any questions about the idea of black men serving the Confederacy? Nothing? So I told you that Wilson Comfort was free man. Do you think he said, oh, sorry, free?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was compulsory.
Hmm?
Were some of them forced to?
Yes. Well, they were all forced to.
Yeah.
There was a mandate sent out that slave owners had to supply manpower for a certain number of weeks or months. And then those that were free, they also passed a piece of legislation that they were required to serve by law for, I don't remember, I have it in my folder, but maybe 2 months, and then if they wanted to continue that, they would be put on a small pay rate. The enslaved people who were serving, their owners got the paychecks. But some of them did get pensions. Now, I've only mentioned 4, but these are from the application database. So it's very well could have been that there were others who didn't survive till 1924. I mean, most of these men are in their late 70s or 80s, and it says, what kind of work do you do? And they said, I can't work. So I've never figured out whether the $25 was a one-time thing, an annual thing. I keep asking Google, and Google doesn't have the answer. They give me other answers. So, okay, so it moves us to a call to action, and it's very simple. I am working feverishly in Culpeper for a memorial to, we have 115 that we've documented, and then another number who fought, who served the Confederacy. And I want there to be a public and permanent recognition and acknowledgement. And I think all our communities need to do that, because they are United States veterans. And I've pushed that argument because I don't know anybody who wants to stand up and say, well, I'm not supporting United States veterans. They may not support them, but they won't say that in public. And so I think it's a sound argument, and I would plant that seed here. I've planted it elsewhere, but you know, it's up to you all. I have all the information that you could ever want. So now we are at the fourth part, which is, again, questions and answers. It can be about this program. How are we doing on time? It can be about this program, or it can be about anything else that I can attempt to add. Oh, there's a hand up.
Well, when you say call to action, how is it that we could help you in your effort to permanently acknowledge these men?
Well, I would rephrase that. It needs to come from within Orange, the Orange citizenry. So if a group got together and said, we think this is a good project, and then they're gonna go out, I mean, I'm happy, that's right up my alley with writing the record. I am happy to come and, you know, help you put that together with other organizations, with the material that you need. Then you have conversation, if you pick out a couple places where it could go, and you talk to those people, and if it's county-owned property, then, you know, you have I wouldn't just go in front of the Board of Supervisors. I would find some that might be supportive and have a one-on-one with them, with your group. And it doesn't mean everybody in here. It could be with CWS, whatever. It could be with the local NAACP. It could be with, I mean, it's a form of tourism. It could be with the Chamber of Commerce. I mean, you have to look for your supporters everywhere, and don't assume that nobody's gonna step up. So, yes.
Have you reached out to the African American Historical Society of Orange? They did a program for us last year on Edna Lewis,
Okay.
and then had installed a historical marker for her. Frank James Monroe
Right.
is the person who was the president that we partnered with.
Right.
They're a pretty strong group, and that's exactly the kind of thing that they do.
I couldn't agree more. And
Uh-huh.
yes, I mean, I was part of that group for 7 years. Was the one who coordinated that wonderful little park. And yeah, it is exactly the kind of thing that group, you know, would want to be involved in, I would think,
I didn't know if they were already
not to my
involved, and
knowledge.
I can't remember if there's something on their website about the black troops,
I don't
colored
know.
troops. I don't know. Charles, do you know?
Are you talking about the county, or
No, the African
African
American
American
Historical
Historical Society.
Society.
I'm not aware of,
Okay.
no.
I do
Anyway,
know the
that's
James Monroe Museum has James Monroe, James Madison. I did a program there, and they've got the panel that has all the names and their regiments on it, and they have poster size of those papers that you have and an exhibit. So they would probably wanna be involved. I would think the Orange County Historical Society would wanna be involved. I mean, there's a number of
Right.
groups. If that answers your question. Back there?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes?
Going back to the soldiers forced to fight with the Confederacy, is there any record of any of them turning on the soldiers in their regiment?
And they weren't really in any regiments, they were labor details. There's a wonderful book called, Black Confederates in Virginia, and, but anyway, it's very well cited, but they used them, largely in hospitals. And you might think, well, gee, guys, because guys, breed nurses, but they use the term nurses pretty loosely. And the mattresses that these men slept on were full of straw and had to be changed regularly. So they needed men of some strength who could lift the soldier off the mattress and put him somewhere else, I guess, while the mattress was being changed. They did use women in the hospitals, but mostly for the laundry. So there just wasn't a lot of opportunity. For a long time, African Americans were not allowed to carry guns, not allowed to own guns, except for maybe a hunting rifle after emancipation. Questions? Helen?
Any stories that you came across, about some of these men or their families that really made an impression on you?
Oh, yeah. Lots of stories, really, because if there's a lot of information in the Fold 3 account that gives you perhaps what they did after the service, after the war, or family member, then you've got tools to dig into a little bit more. I traced one man, and I'm sorry, I'm not gonna be able to, I didn't bring all the files with me, so I can't give you the names. But he was from Madison County, actually, and he was with a unit that went, the movie Glory? Okay. He apparently wasn't with that unit, but there was a unit sent in, regiment sent in after them, and he was part of that, and he was captured in Charleston, South Carolina, and was put in prison. And he had enlisted in New York, despite the fact he was born in Madison County, Virginia. And so after the war was over, he was sent to a Union hospital, and from there we found records of transportation from the hospital back to New York. And I remember, let me see if I can remember. I can't. So his occupation was listed as something like a key holder. That's not correct.
Joseph Bayard.
What?
Joseph Bayard
Oh.
is the
thank
name.
you. What's his occupation?
Turnkey.
Turnkey. Thank you. I got the key in there. And I had to, that's one of the things that this research has done. Whenever I came up with a word I didn't know, and a lot of it was in medical descriptions, I went and looked it up. So a turnkey was the jailer who turned a key and locked a cell. So that was his occupation, and I think he did that after he returned. And I tried to trace him further. I think he ended up, are you looking at what I have, something I've written?
No, just up to the battle at Fort Wagner.
Okay.
That's all.
Okay, well, anyway, he ended up in a soldier's home and died there. And he had a daughter, and I just couldn't, it's very, very time. It just sucks all the time out of your day, and it's good. But if you have other things that you have to do, you put it aside, and then sometimes you end up having to start, not entirely from scratch, but again, you have to start again. So there are a lot of stories in these records, and I think we need to know them. But the first thing we need to know is the men. And there weren't any women that we've run across. There were women who were spies, but not who actually fought. So that's, if I could come back and just read you stories of some of these men. And there was one guy who was from Orange. I'm pretty sure he was from Orange, and he got discharged very early. Let's say he enlisted in April and he got discharged in May, and the reason given was that he couldn't wear shoes.
Mm.
So I don't know whether his feet were deformed at birth, whether they were possibly deformed from punishment. That's one of the things they did to runaways, was to beat their feet. Or that he simply spent his life barefoot and now couldn't get his feet into a shoe. But they discharged him because he couldn't wear any shoes. So some of it's just tidbits, but it does give you some insight into the people. Yes, ma'am.
Was there any formal relationship between the spies and the colored troops? The African Americans, like in Richmond, who were feeding information, they would not have been enlisted. They were just spies serving to help the Union?
I don't have the answer to
Okay.
that. Most of those spies, whether they were women of color or they were white women, reported to the white officers, not to the individual soldiers.
And there's of course Elizabeth Van Lew, whose servant served as a spy. She was working in the Confederate White House.
Others? I know it's a lot of information to take in. I think if you can take away that they are United States veterans, they deserve to be recognized, and their lives will, if we do that much, there will be other people who come forward and attempt to really dig in and flesh out their lives, both before and if they survived after. Now, rarely did they come back to the place where they were born, for kind of obvious reasons. There's a few that did, but it's not common. Helen, did you want to ask me about anything else?
Well, I'd really like, totally off the topic as such, but how did you ever get involved in this kind of research?
I guess it's because I just, I'm stubborn and I'm always interested in what we don't know. And somebody tells me, oh, you're not gonna find it, it's just like a trigger. It's just, when I did, Charles, can I get that book a second?
Oh.
Uh-oh, sorry. Another big project I have is the lynching victims in Virginia. There have been 116 identified. There were 3 in Culpeper. Technically there are none in Orange County, although there's 2 particular cases that could be argued were a form of lynching. But they weren't arrested, and that's pretty critical. The definition of lynching is extrajudicial murder. So outside the judicial system, they murdered people. And so back in 2003, it came to my attention that there was a fella in 1918 who had been lynched in Culpeper, and his name was Allie Thompson. He was 18 years old. And so the local reporter, who's still the local reporter, Allison Brophy Champion, and I dug into that. And when she called me and said, do you have any information on this? I was director of the museum, and I knew we didn't. But I always said I would go look, and so I figured it'd be 15 minutes. 6 months later, we finally published a 3-part series, and I've been continuing. When I did this, which is the documentation the courts needed to make a ruling on the 3 men that were charged and lynched in Culpeper, I found new information, still after all these years, about Allie Thompson's family. And when Allison and I would go to the courthouse, the clerks in the courthouse, and I don't fault them, they have a lot of heavy lifting with all the court cases now. And they don't know what's in the old portion. And they told me right now, there was no information there. I said, okay. And when we went to Madison, we got that same answer, and Allison got mad. And I said, Allison, these are the gatekeepers. For any of you all who have any interest in research, you cannot
It's off the gatekeeper.
tick them off, or you can get no access. So in Culpeper, there's a wall that has all these metal cans. They look like ammo cans, and you're not allowed to pull them down. The clerks have to pull them down, and then the clerks have to stand there while you go through them. So I had found the information, but I wanted to revisit it, and I went in there last year, and oh no, it's not in there. It's not in there. I'd already seen it. It's not in there. I said, look, doggone it. Do you mind if I just look anyway? So, and then I have a good relationship with the clerk, and they told them they did not need to sit there and babysit me. So, you have to, and this is part of the thrill for me, I guess, Helen, is that it's an investigation, and you have to think outside the box, and you have to think like they thought. And today, when you're looking up, criminal records, there's a different process than there was in 1850 or 1877 or even 1918. In 1918 and all those other years, the arrest record came from the magistrate who lived in that jurisdiction. And they would inform the sheriff, I'm sending this guy in, put him in jail. So then you have to look for the magistrate's records. So not only is it sort of a whole new world, and in our state, in our part of the country, the predominant untold stories are with African Americans, but they're also with Native Americans. This writing the record thing applies if you were in California, and after we did this event in December, and the Washington Post did an article, I got calls from California and from Georgia and from Maine, because they have their own minorities who have been charged with something and due process didn't happen. And that was the judge's ruling on these 3 men, is that 2 of them never got a trial. They were American citizens. And the 14th Amendment said that they are entitled to due process, a trial. They didn't get it. The earlier one actually got 2 trials and was scheduled for a 3rd. Very interesting case. And he had a lawyer, which I haven't figured out how he did that, but the lawyer took it to the state Supreme Court twice, and twice the state Supreme Court overturned the conviction in the lower court, which sentenced him to death by hanging for murder. The state Supreme Court said, not only do you not have the evidence to convict this man of murder, you don't have enough evidence to convict him of anything. So they were scheduling a 3rd trial, which would be moved to Fauquier County. And the local folks said, no, they're gonna find him innocent and we can't have that. So they broke him out of jail and hanged him. Then the judge today said, I'm ruling that they are innocent of these charges and forever will be, because they never got due process. Which is hard to dispute. I don't care what side of the aisle you sit on. If they didn't get due process, they were not proven guilty. I tend to be a little oversimplistic. So, there's the thrill of the hunt, but then what's more important is to see the community come together, white and black, over doing the right thing. And that's what we saw. And those were the comments that came out in the Washington Post, the Culpeper paper. And it's interesting, one of the finds that I had in the Allie Thompson case, there was this fellow named Moses Summons. He was a black man that lived in the area. And after Allie was murdered, he wrote to the governor an 11-page letter, handwritten. I've transcribed it. I don't think it's in here, but maybe, Charles. And I used it in my remarks of that when we did that event. He was quite well educated and maybe self-educated, I don't know, but he was very articulate. And the thing that stood out for me is and I used this quote, he said, "We do not cry for vengeance, but instead we cry for truth and justice." Still puts goosebumps on me. So, I'm done unless you have any questions.
No. Probably you'll send them the rest of,
What about it?
you'll email them.
Thank
You're welcome.
Zann, thank you so much, and really, really appreciate your expertise, but also your own zeal. And I mean, that's part of the reason why we have this organization. We want to learn. We want to find out about things we didn't know, whether it's about a building, whether it's about an organization, whether it's about people. And for me, people really are where it comes down to, and how there's so much, like I know in my own family, things that I never knew before that come out when you get together with other family members. Did you know so-and-so did? No, I didn't.
Particularly if you're the youngest
family.
in your family.
Yeah, but when you realize in our own history, here in this country, in this area, there's so much we don't know that needs to be uncovered. And I think it would help us understand so much more about today and going forward if we understood more. So thank you for all that you do and for sharing with us today.
Well,
Very
thank you for
grateful.
having me, and thanks for the yummy food. I will leave you with one thing. I know you're going to Culpeper to see the Burger Bean House. one of the things we've done, the 200 block of West
Somewhere on Davis.
East Davis, it goes down towards the depot.
Mhm.
That was the black commercial district during segregation for decades. So before we lost all that information, we partnered with the town, and we have put up 6 or 7 plaques on the buildings. It's not everybody, but it's a start. And on those plaques, there's a QR code, which you can do from here, or you can do while you're walking down the street. And it goes back to the tourism website, and you can read all about the building and the owner or the businessman, person.
Next thing to do.
So,
The mural on the end building there,
yes,
uh,
there's, and the Culpeper Renaissance did that. It's a group on the side of the Lightfoot building. It's a collection of identified as trailblazers, men and women, trying to kind of eliminate the black heritage. So, yeah, we just got a spot in all of weirdo places, Travel and Leisure Magazine.
Wow.
Yeah, about our efforts at black heritage in Culpeper.
Excellent. Excellent.
Oh, and you mentioned Bloomsbury, we did go to Bloomsbury.
Yeah. Did you see my little writer? There's a handout, that I did a lot of research on, figuring out the names of the black folks that lived there, like the Crump brothers. Yeah. So if you wanna take a gander at some of these, resources, please feel free.